The seeker stands at the threshold of an ancient mystery, one that has haunted the margins of Western consciousness since the Hermetic texts first emerged from the intellectual ferment of Hellenistic Alexandria. The dark night of the soul, that profound descent into psychological dissolution, represents not merely a poetic metaphor for suffering, but rather a structured, inevitable phase within the alchemical great work, a phase the medieval adepts termed Nigredo, the blackening. This is the philosophical problem that confronts every genuine aspirant to self-knowledge. How does one reconcile the necessity of psychological death with the promise of spiritual rebirth? How does consciousness transform itself through the deliberate embrace of its own dissolution? The genealogy of this concept traces through a distinguished lineage of esoteric thought. Hermes Trismegistus, that mythical synthesis of Egyptian Thoth and Greek Hermes, established in the Corpus Hermeticum the foundational principle: that which is above is like that which is below to accomplish the miracle of one thing. This axiom implies that the macrocosmic processes of universal transformation find their microcosmic reflection in the human psyche. The alchemists of the European Middle Ages and Renaissance, Paracelsus, Basil Valentine, and later the Rosicrucian adepts, understood their laboratory operations as simultaneous material and psychological endeavors. The opus alchemicum was never merely about transmuting base metals into gold. It concerned the transformation of the prima materia, of consciousness itself. Carl Gustav Jung, drawing upon this reservoir of symbolic wisdom in the 20th century, recognized in alchemical imagery a sophisticated map of psychological individuation. His confrontation with the unconscious, documented in the Red Book, led him to understand that the alchemists were projecting their own unconscious processes onto matter. The Nigredo phase, with its associations of putrefaction, decomposition and mortification, corresponded precisely to what the Spanish mystic San Juan de la Cruz called la noche oscura del alma, the dark night of the soul. Both traditions recognized an essential truth: authentic transformation cannot occur without the prior dissolution of existing psychic structures. The premise that emerges from this convergence of alchemical, mystical, and psychological traditions is unequivocal. The true secret is an internal undertaking, a psycho-spiritual operation that demands the complete dismantling of one's familiar identity. The gold sought by the alchemist exists not in the external world, but in the depths of consciousness itself. This is the sacred task that awaits the modern seeker, not escape from suffering, but descent into it, not avoidance of the shadow, but deliberate confrontation with everything one has exiled from awareness. To comprehend the Nigredo phase with proper rigor, one must first understand the complete system of alchemical transformation and its psychological correlates. The great work unfolds according to a precise sequence of stages, each representing both a chemical operation and a psychological transformation. The classical schema presents four primary phases: Nigredo, blackening; albedo, whitening; citrinitas, yellowing; and rubedo, reddening, though many texts collapse the third stage into the others, leaving the essential triadic structure of black, white, and red. The alchemical tradition operates through a complex system of correspondences. The three philosophical principles: sulfur, the active masculine solar principle; Mercury, the volatile mediating hermaphroditic principle; and salt, the fixed corporeal passive principle, must be separated, purified, and recombined throughout the work. This triadic schema echoes through multiple esoteric systems: the Kabbalistic pillars of severity, mercy, and mildness; the Neoplatonic hierarchy of the One, Nous, and Soul; the Rosicrucian understanding of body, soul, and spirit. The alchemist's task involves the systematic decomposition of these principles in their crude natural state, followed by their progressive refinement and eventual reunion in a higher synthesis. Jung's psychological interpretation reveals the profound sophistication of this symbolic system. Sulfur corresponds to the conscious ego and its willful intentionality. Mercury represents the unconscious itself, fluid and transformative. Salt embodies the body and concrete reality. The alchemical process thus describes the ego's necessary dissolution into the unconscious, Nigredo, the gradual emergence of psychic contents previously unavailable to consciousness, albedo, and their final integration into a transformed, more comprehensive center of personality, what Jung termed the self, rubedo. This is not mere allegory, but a rigorous phenomenology of psychological transformation. The mentality required of the adept cannot be overstated in its difficulty and rarity. This work demands what Aleister Crowley called true will, not the petty desires of the ego, but the fundamental orientation of one's entire being toward self-realization. It requires what the Rosicrucians understood as absolute sincerity, the capacity to observe oneself with merciless honesty. The occult path is not for the credulous or the desperate seeking supernatural solutions to mundane problems. Rather, it attracts those rare individuals capable of sustained intellectual rigor, those willing to question every assumption, including and especially the assumption of their own goodness, sanity, and coherence. The ethical dimension of this work must be emphasized. The occultist operates according to principles that transcend conventional morality while incorporating its genuine insights. The Hermetic maxim, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law," does not sanction license but rather describes the alignment of individual will with universal principle. The adept cultivates what might be called a tragic ethics, the recognition that growth necessitates suffering, that consciousness emerges only through confrontation with its own negation, that the path to integration leads inevitably through disintegration. This is not pessimism, but rather a sober acknowledgement of the actual conditions of psychological transformation. The Hermetic principles themselves, mentalism, correspondence, vibration, polarity, rhythm, cause and effect, and gender, provide the philosophical framework within which the alchemical work unfolds. Most relevant to understanding the Nigredo is the principle of rhythm. Everything flows out and in, everything has its tides, all things rise and fall. The descent into darkness is not pathology, but the necessary downward arc of a rhythm that will eventually swing upward. The principle of polarity teaches that opposites are identical in nature, but different in degree. Thus, the extreme darkness of the Nigredo contains within itself the seed of illumination. The Nigredo phase does not arrive unannounced. It typically follows what alchemists called the conjunctio, the preliminary union of opposites that precipitates the crisis. In psychological terms, this represents the moment when the ego, having achieved a certain stability and success in the external world, encounters for the first time the reality of the unconscious as a force equal or superior to itself. The individual may experience this as a sudden loss of meaning, the collapse of long-held beliefs, the failure of relationships or career, or an inexplicable depression that descends without apparent cause. What distinguishes this from ordinary suffering is its quality of inevitability and its resistance to conventional solutions. No change in external circumstances alleviates it. No distraction provides lasting relief. The first operation of the Nigredo is Calcinatio, the burning away of superfluities. In the laboratory, this involves heating a substance until only its essential components remain. Psychologically, Calcinatio represents the ego's encounter with its own limitations, the burning away of inflated self-concepts and grandiose fantasies. The individual discovers that who they believed themselves to be was largely a construction, a persona assembled from social expectations, inherited beliefs, and defensive strategies. This fire is intensely painful because it attacks precisely those self-images in which one has invested the most psychic energy. The successful professional discovers their ambition was compensating for profound feelings of worthlessness. The devoted parent realizes their sacrifice masked a need for control. The spiritual seeker confronts the ego inflation hidden within their humility. Following Calcinatio comes Solutio, dissolution in water. Where fire purifies through destruction, water dissolves boundaries and merges what was separate. This operation corresponds to the flooding of consciousness by unconscious contents previously held at bay. Dreams become vivid and disturbing. Emotions surge without apparent cause. The rational mind, so reliable in navigating the external world, proves helpless before these internal tides. The individual may experience this as depression, as the loss of all motivation and energy. What was solid becomes liquid. What was defined loses its boundaries. This is the psychological equivalent of putrefaction, the rotting away of psychic structures that have outlived their usefulness. The mortificatio, the death operation, represents the nadir of the Nigredo. This is the actual psychological death that the process demands, not metaphorical but experientially real. The ego, stripped of its defenses by Calcinatio and dissolved by Solutio, now confronts its own non-existence. This is the moment of supreme crisis when suicide may appear as the only logical solution to unbearable psychic pain. The individual experiences what mystics have called the death of God, not as atheistic intellectual position, but as the actual loss of any transcendent meaning or purpose. Everything that once motivated action now appears as illusion. Every value reveals itself as arbitrary. The ground has fallen away and there is only the vertiginous horror of the abyss. Yet the alchemical texts insist that this death is generative. The putrefactio, the rotting of the dead matter, produces the philosophical mercury, the transformative substance that makes the subsequent work possible. In psychological terms, the ego's death reveals the self, that larger center of personality that transcends and includes the ego. But this revelation comes only through absolute surrender. The ego must die not knowing it will be resurrected. The faith that sustains the adept through this phase is not belief in a doctrine, but rather the empirical observation, gleaned from the testimonies of those who have completed the work, that consciousness can survive its own dissolution and emerge transformed. The shadow, Jung's term for the repressed, rejected, and denied aspects of personality, becomes fully visible during the Nigredo. What distinguishes this confrontation from ordinary self-criticism is its comprehensiveness and depth. The shadow contains not merely individual failings, but the entirety of one's unlived life, every road not taken, every possibility rejected in the construction of a socially acceptable identity. It includes the personal shadow, one's own repressed desires and fears, but also the collective shadow, the archetypal forces of destruction, sexuality and power that civilization attempts to domesticate. The confrontation with the shadow proceeds through specific stages. First comes recognition, the shocking discovery that the qualities one most despises in others exist within oneself. The moralizing critic discovers their own hidden transgressions. The virtuous citizen confronts their capacity for cruelty. This recognition typically arrives through projection. One suddenly realizes that what they hate in another is precisely what they cannot accept in themselves. Second comes the work of withdrawal of projections, the painful process of reclaiming one's disowned psychological contents. This requires extraordinary honesty and the willingness to sacrifice one's cherished self-image. Third comes the actual integration of shadow material, the incorporation of previously rejected aspects of personality into consciousness. This does not mean acting out destructive impulses, but rather acknowledging their existence and finding appropriate channels for their expression. The integrated shadow provides access to vitality, creativity, and authentic power that the purely persona-identified ego lacks. The individual becomes more rather than less moral, but their morality now rests on conscious choice rather than unconscious repression. The alchemical separatio corresponds to this discriminating work with the shadow. Having dissolved everything in Solutio, the adept must now separate the valuable from the worthless, the gold from the dross. Not everything that emerges from the unconscious deserves integration. Some contents are genuinely pathological, the products of trauma or cultural conditioning that must be recognized and released rather than incorporated. The discriminating intelligence must remain active even in the midst of dissolution. This requires tremendous psychological sophistication, the capacity to observe oneself with both complete honesty and critical judgment. Throughout the Nigredo, dreams become the primary medium through which the unconscious communicates. The individual may dream of descending into caves or underground chambers, of drowning, of encountering terrifying figures, of witnessing death and decay. These images are not random, but constitute a symbolic language describing the actual transformations occurring in the psyche. Jung spent decades learning to read this language, and his work on alchemy represents his most mature attempt to provide a hermeneutic for these symbols. The adept must learn to attend to dreams with the same rigor a scientist brings to experimental data, recording them, analyzing their patterns, and allowing them to guide the work. The Nigredo phase inevitably precipitates what can only be described as an existential crisis of the most profound order. This is not the fashionable angst of undergraduate philosophy students, but rather the actual dissolution of the structures that make existence bearable. The medieval alchemists understood this with perfect clarity when they warned that the work was dangerous, that many who undertook it would be destroyed rather than transformed. The Rosicrucian manifestos speak of those who approached the temple and were turned away, unable to bear what they found. This crisis must be distinguished categorically from clinical depression or other psychiatric pathologies, though it may superficially resemble them. Clinical depression typically involves a generalized diminishment of affect, motivation, and cognitive function. It responds to medication, therapy, and behavioral interventions. The Nigredo crisis, by contrast, possesses what might be called a teleological quality. It is going somewhere, serving a purpose within the larger economy of the psyche. Where depression represents a failure of psychological function, the dark night represents its intensification to an unbearable degree. The individual remains fully conscious, even hyperconscious, of their suffering. Every illusion, every self-deception, stands revealed in merciless clarity. This is not a pathological state, but rather the natural and inevitable consequence of attempting to transform consciousness itself. The phenomenology of this crisis deserves detailed examination. The individual experiences what mystics have called dereliction, the complete abandonment by any sense of divine presence or transcendent meaning. Where previously life possessed purpose and direction, now there is only arbitrary succession of moments leading nowhere. The future, which once held promise, now appears as merely more of the unbearable present. The past, rather than providing comfort or identity, reveals itself as a series of mistakes, failures, and self-deceptions. Even memory becomes unreliable. One can no longer trust their own narrative about who they are and how they came to be. Social relationships become impossible to maintain authentically. The individual can no longer perform the ordinary social rituals that once came naturally. Small talk appears as grotesque theater, a collective agreement to ignore the abyss over which existence is suspended. Friends and family, sensing the change, typically respond with concern that quickly turns to frustration and then withdrawal. How can one explain to those who have not undertaken the work that one is dying in order to be reborn? That this suffering is necessary and even voluntary. The isolation intensifies, and with it the temptation to abandon the work and return to ordinary unconsciousness. The crisis attacks the very faculty of valuation. The individual can no longer determine what is important, what deserves attention or effort. Action becomes difficult because all actions appear equally meaningless. This is not the apathy of depression, but rather the consequence of seeing through the arbitrary nature of all human projects. One continues to function, goes to work, maintains basic self-care, but these activities occur mechanically, without the felt sense of meaning that once motivated them. It is as if one is watching oneself perform life's routines from a great distance, with detached fascination and horror. The temptation to suicide during this phase must be acknowledged honestly. When life has been completely stripped of meaning, when the ego has been revealed as an illusion, when suffering intensifies without apparent purpose, death appears not as tragedy, but as logical solution. The alchemical texts warn against this temptation, not through moral prohibition, but through the assertion that death at this stage would abort the work entirely. The individual would die having dissolved their previous identity, but without achieving the transformation that justifies the dissolution. They would perish in the Nigredo, their prima materia scattered and lost. What sustains the adept through this ordeal? Not hope, for hope itself has been burned away. Not faith in the conventional sense, for the Nigredo destroys all comforting beliefs. Rather, it is what might be called metaphysical courage, the determination to see the process through to its conclusion regardless of cost. This courage does not arise from the ego, which has already died or is dying. It emerges from a deeper stratum of personality, from what Jung called the self, that larger organizing principle that survives the ego's dissolution. The individual discovers, in the midst of complete dereliction, that something observes the suffering. Something remains when everything else has been stripped away. The philosophical significance of this crisis lies in its revelation that consciousness can survive the destruction of all its contents. The Cartesian cogito, I think, therefore I am, is revealed as superficial. More fundamental is the realization that consciousness persists even when thinking, feeling, and willing have been suspended. This is the mystical insight at the heart of numerous traditions, that the true self is not the ego, not the contents of consciousness, but consciousness itself, the pure awareness that witnesses all psychological events. The Nigredo forces this realization not through intellectual insight, but through direct agonizing experience. The difference between this esoteric crisis and genuine pathology lies in its containment and directionality. The adept, even in the midst of dissolution, maintains some degree of observing awareness. They understand, however dimly, that they are undergoing a process rather than simply suffering meaningless affliction. This understanding may be minimal, a thread of remembered teaching from the tradition, a fragment of text that provides a conceptual container for the experience, but it is sufficient to prevent complete psychotic breakdown. The pathological dissolution lacks this container. It is pure chaos without structure or meaning. The alchemical dissolution, however terrible, unfolds according to a pattern, fulfills a purpose and moves toward resolution. The transition from Nigredo to albedo does not occur suddenly, but rather through a gradual lightening of the darkness, a dawn that arrives almost imperceptibly. The first sign of change is typically the return of dreams, not the terrifying nightmares of the Nigredo, but images of washing, purification, and gentle light. The individual may dream of dawn breaking, of snow falling, of entering a white room or temple. These images signal that the work of decomposition has completed and the work of purification can begin. The putrefied matter, having been reduced to its essential components, now undergoes cleansing and refinement. The albedo phase involves the careful separation and washing of the philosophical mercury, the extraction of the pure essence from the decomposed prima materia. Psychologically, this corresponds to the gradual integration of unconscious contents that were revealed during the Nigredo. The individual begins to understand their shadow not as an enemy to be destroyed, but as rejected aspects of self that can be reincorporated into consciousness. This integration proceeds slowly, requiring constant vigilance and discrimination. Not every unconscious content deserves integration. Some must be recognized and released. But what is genuinely one's own, what has been exiled through social conditioning or traumatic repression, can now be reclaimed. The experience of the albedo is characterized by a sense of relief and clarity absent during the Nigredo. The crushing weight of meaninglessness lifts. Colors appear brighter, sounds clearer. The individual rediscovers the capacity for pleasure, though this pleasure differs qualitatively from pre-Nigredo hedonic experience. It is simpler, more direct, less contaminated by ego inflation or compensatory striving. A walk in nature, a conversation with a friend, the taste of food, these ordinary experiences are perceived with renewed immediacy and appreciation. This is not regression to naive enjoyment, but rather a mature simplicity earned through suffering. The rubedo phase represents the final stage of the alchemical work, the appearance of the philosopher's stone, or the realization of the self. In this phase, the purified and separated elements undergo final conjunction, a sacred marriage that produces the transformed being. The individual ego, having died in the Nigredo and been purified in the albedo, now reunites with the self in a relationship of proper subordination. The ego recognizes itself as an organ of the self, serving its purposes rather than pursuing its own aggrandizement. This does not mean loss of individuality, but rather the discovery of one's true individuality, stripped of persona and shadow contamination. The integrated individual displays certain recognizable characteristics. First, they possess a quality of presence, a groundedness and centeredness that others can sense immediately. This presence arises not from confidence in the conventional sense, but from having confronted and survived psychological death. Second, they demonstrate remarkable psychological flexibility, capable of adapting to circumstances without losing their essential orientation. Third, they display what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold opposites in consciousness without splitting or repression. They can acknowledge their shadow without being overwhelmed by it, access their anima or animus without identification, and relate to archetypal energies without inflation. The ethical implications of this transformation are substantial. The integrated individual acts not from repression or blind adherence to external rules, but from conscious choice grounded in self-knowledge. They recognize the capacity for evil within themselves, and therefore respond to evil in others, not with outrage but with recognition and appropriate boundaries. Their compassion is not sentimental but realistic, acknowledging the actual conditions of human existence. They assume responsibility not only for their actions, but for their psychological state, recognizing that consciousness itself is their primary work. The relationship to the external world changes fundamentally. Where the pre-Nigredo ego sought validation, success, and recognition, the transformed self participates in life from intrinsic motivation. Work becomes vocation, not merely occupation but calling. Relationships become encounters between authentic persons rather than transactions between masks. The individual discovers that they need far less than they previously believed: fewer possessions, less status, minimal external validation. This is not asceticism, but rather the natural consequence of having discovered a more reliable source of fulfillment in psychological integration itself. The responsibility that accompanies this transformation cannot be evaded. Having been granted insight into the nature of consciousness and the process of transformation, the adept assumes an obligation to the tradition and to those who will follow. This responsibility manifests not through proselytizing or dramatic revelation, but through the quality of one's being. The transformed individual becomes a living demonstration of possibility, evidence that the great work is not merely metaphor, but achievable reality. They may teach directly if called to do so, but their primary teaching is their existence itself. This is the purpose and justification of the Hermetic school's rigorous approach to esoteric study. These traditions have preserved, across centuries of cultural upheaval and religious persecution, precise maps of consciousness and systematic methods for its transformation. They demand intellectual rigor, not because they are elitist, but because psychological transformation is genuinely difficult and dangerous. The casual seeker, the spiritual tourist seeking weekend enlightenment, lacks the discipline necessary to complete the work. Only those willing to question everything, to endure the dissolution of self, to maintain consciousness through the dark night, only these rare individuals will achieve the integration toward which the tradition points. As the investigation concludes, the seeker must confront a final, uncompromising truth. The gold that alchemists sought, the stone that transmutes all metals, the elixir that grants immortality, none of these exist in the external world. They never did. The medieval alchemists who died in their laboratories poisoned by mercury vapors were not simply wrong in their chemistry. They had mistaken the map for the territory, projected their internal process onto external matter. The true gold is consciousness itself, transformed through deliberate and disciplined inner work. The philosopher's stone is the integrated self, that achievement of psychological wholeness that grants not physical immortality, but rather liberation from the compulsive repetition of unconscious patterns. The journey through the Nigredo reveals that transformation requires not elevation, but descent, not addition, but subtraction, not construction, but destruction, followed by reconstruction. The modern world, obsessed with progress, optimization, and improvement, recoils from this ancient wisdom. Contemporary culture offers 1,000 ways to avoid the dark night. Pharmaceuticals, entertainment, spiritual bypassing, positive thinking, therapeutic platitudes. All of these represent evasion of the great work, attempts to achieve wholeness without paying the price of psychological death. The Hermetic school exists to preserve and transmit the authentic path through this darkness. It offers no shortcuts, no comforting illusions, no promise of easy transformation. It presents instead the testimonies of those who have completed the work, the symbolic languages they developed to describe the indescribable, and the rigorous methods they employed to navigate the chaos of the unconscious. This is not a path for everyone. Most will choose the easier route of unconscious existence, and this too is their right and perhaps their wisdom. But for those rare individuals capable of enduring the fire of self-examination, willing to sacrifice everything they believe themselves to be, determined to discover what remains when all illusions have burned away, for these seekers, the tradition awaits with its ancient and terrible knowledge. The gold you seek does not lie in the crucible, but in the will that kindles the flame.